Dick Whittington's success story has got everything. The poor orphan boy who goes to the city, dreaming that the streets are paved with gold. The kindly employer who rescues him from his privations. The cat that unexpectedly wins him fame and fortune.
On the evening of August 4th, 1984, Richard Burton went to bed in Switzerland with a headache, and he never woke up. He was 58 years old. He had been the greatest classical actor of his generation, a Welsh coal miner's son with a voice like an organ, once considered the natural heir to Laurence Olivier. He had also, for the last 22 years, been the most famous husband in the world. When Elizabeth Taylor was told, she collapsed. Their marriages had been over for 8 years. She was living her 6th marriage by then, to a United States senator. It did not matter. The love that had begun on the set of Cleopatra in 1961, that had made them the most watched couple on the planet, that had produced 2 marriages, 2 divorces, 11 films together, one of the greatest diamond collections in history, and a scandal so vast the Vatican itself denounced them, had never actually ended. She had loved Richard Burton her entire adult life, and now he was gone. She was denied entry to his funeral by his 4th wife. That is where this story ends. Where it begins is a lot more spectacular. 2 of the biggest movie stars in the world, both married to other people, one of them married to the woman she had already stolen from Debbie Reynolds, meeting on a Rome soundstage in the middle of the most disastrous, over-budget film production in Hollywood history, and setting off an affair so consuming that a US congressman tried to have Burton's visa revoked, and the Pope's own newspaper accused Elizabeth Taylor of, in the phrase that has followed her for 60 years, erotic vagrancy. She was 30, he was 36. She had been famous her entire life, a child star since National Velvet, an Oscar winner, already on her 4th marriage. He was a serious stage actor, the classical genius who had walked away from a knighthood and had a wife and 2 young daughters back home in Switzerland. They looked at each other on a Roman soundstage in 1961 and could not stop, and neither of them ever really could stop, for the next 23 years, through 2 marriages and 2 divorces and multiple attempts to make it work with other people, because what they had was too powerful to survive and too powerful to let go. They spent $1 million on a diamond simply because he wrote that it belonged on the loveliest woman in the world. They fought so violently, drunk, that hotels asked them to leave. They drank themselves toward the graves that would take them both. Burton at 58, from a brain hemorrhage his lifetime of drinking had helped arrange. Elizabeth years later, her body wrecked by decades of painkillers and alcohol, and the health problems she never quite escaped. He was one of the greatest actors the 20th century ever produced, and he never won the Academy Award his talent deserved. She won 2 Oscars, but her serious work was overwhelmed for years by the tabloid circus their marriage created. This is the story of the love that made both of them mythic and ruined both of them in the process. The affair that shattered marriages and turned into a marriage that could not survive itself. The 2 people who could not stay together and could not stay apart, whose love was the biggest story in the world for 20 years and whose lives were, quietly and steadily, being consumed by it the entire time. She spent the last 27 years of her life keeping a letter he had written her days before he died, in which he told her he wanted to come home. She kept it in the drawer of her bedside table until she died in 2011. Home meant her. This is the story of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, the greatest love affair in Hollywood history, and the one that ruined them both. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. By the time Elizabeth Taylor walked onto the set of Cleopatra in 1961, she had already been famous for 18 years. She had been born in London in 1932 to American parents, an art dealer father and a former stage actress mother, and the family had moved to Los Angeles at the start of the Second World War when she was 7. She had huge violet eyes, a double row of eyelashes that photographers said made the camera weep, and an ambitious mother who took her almost immediately to Universal, then to MGM, where a talent executive looked at the 9-year-old and signed her on the spot. By 10, she was in her first film. By 12, she was starring in National Velvet, playing a girl who rides a horse to victory in the Grand National, and she was, from that film onward, one of the most famous children in the world. She grew up on soundstages. She had almost no ordinary childhood, and she grew up faster than a child was supposed to, because MGM was building an adult star out of a girl, and by 15 she was playing love scenes with grown men, and by 17 she was engaged. She had been married 3 times by the time she was 26, and the third marriage had ended in a tragedy that changed everything about how the public saw her. Her first marriage, at 18, was to Conrad Nicky Hilton, the hotel heir, and it lasted less than a year. She said, later, that he had been abusive to her, and she came out of it younger than a woman coming out of a first marriage was supposed to feel, and she went straight into her second, to the British actor Michael Wilding, 20 years her senior. That marriage produced 2 sons and ended after 5 years. And then, in 1957, at 25, she married Mike Todd, the loud, brash, cigar-chomping producer of Around the World in 80 Days. And by every account of the people who knew her, he was the love of her young life. He was older than she was, 22 years older, but he adored her, and she adored him, and for a little over a year, Elizabeth Taylor was as happy as she had ever been. Then, in March of 1958, Mike Todd got on a private plane called the Lucky Liz to fly from Los Angeles to New York, and it went down in the Zuni Mountains of New Mexico. He was killed. Elizabeth was 26 years old, a widow with 3 children, and she was in the deepest grief of her life. The man who consoled her was Mike Todd's best friend, Eddie Fisher, the American pop singer, who happened to be married to Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart. The consolation became an affair. The affair became a scandal. And in 1959, Elizabeth Taylor married Eddie Fisher, and the American public, which had adored her as the tragic young widow, turned on her almost overnight as the woman who had taken Debbie Reynolds' husband. She was, in the phrase the press invented, a homewrecker. She had been a homewrecker for barely 2 years when 20th Century Fox cast her as Cleopatra, gave her the largest salary in film history at that point, $1 million against a share of the profits, and sent her to Rome to make what would become one of the most infamous productions in Hollywood history. Waiting for her there, cast as Mark Antony, was a Welsh actor named Richard Burton. He had grown up in a mining valley in South Wales, the 12th of 13 children of a coal miner named Richard Jenkins, in a house so poor and so crowded that when he was 2 years old, his mother died in childbirth with her 13th child, and Richard was sent to live with his older sister and her husband. He was raised, effectively, by his sister. He grew up speaking Welsh at home and English at school, and he was, from the beginning, an astonishingly bright boy. A schoolteacher named Philip Burton saw the boy's gift, took him under his wing, and eventually became his legal guardian, and Richard Jenkins took the teacher's surname and became Richard Burton. Philip Burton trained the boy's voice. That voice was the thing that would define Richard Burton for the rest of his life. It was deep, resonant, and musical, capable of holding an audience in complete stillness across a Shakespeare monologue. He went to Oxford briefly during the war, joined the RAF, and after the war he became a serious classical stage actor. By his 30s he was playing Hamlet, and playing it so well that Winston Churchill supposedly attended and murmured the lines along with him from the stalls. He was considered by many the natural heir to Laurence Olivier as the great English-language stage actor of his generation. He was also, by then, a serious drinker, in the specific Welsh literary tradition of drinking, and married to a fellow Welsh actress named Sybil Williams. Sybil was, by every account of the people who knew her, gentle, warm, deeply devoted to him, and had put up with his string of on-set affairs for years because Burton's affairs with his co-stars were an accepted part of what he did. They meant nothing. He always came home to Sybil. They had 2 daughters together, and Sybil, the good Welsh wife, was the anchor of his life. He arrived in Rome in September of 1961, hired for Cleopatra at a huge salary because the production was in disarray and needed a name, hungover from the previous night and utterly unprepared for what was about to happen to him. His first scene was with Elizabeth Taylor. He was shaking so badly from the previous night's drinking that his hand rattled the coffee cup he was holding. She looked at him and, according to her own account later, thought he was faking. She thought this famous serious actor was pretending to be nervous, playing at charm to unsettle her. She was going to be wrong about almost everything she thought about Richard Burton in that first minute, and she was going to be wrong for the next 23 years. The affair started almost immediately, and neither of them made much effort to hide it. Elizabeth was 30 and unhappily married to Eddie Fisher, a fact the whole world knew but nobody talked about publicly. Richard was 36 and married to Sybil, the way he had always been married to Sybil, with occasional side affairs that meant nothing. The way it worked with Burton, everybody understood, was that he flirted, he slept with his co-stars, and he came home. That was the arrangement. Elizabeth Taylor was not going to be a side affair. By early 1962, they were being seen together on the Cleopatra set in ways that could not be ignored, then off the set in ways that made the ignoring impossible. In March of that year, paparazzi photographed them kissing on a yacht off the island of Ischia. The photograph went around the world within days. 20 of Elizabeth's makeup and hair people got the picture into every major newspaper on the planet, and the affair, which had been a rumor in Rome, became the biggest scandal in the world. The reaction was enormous, and it was ugly. Elizabeth was already the woman who had taken Debbie Reynolds's husband 3 years earlier. Now she was taking Sybil Burton's husband, and Sybil was a beloved, dignified, wronged Welsh wife with 2 young daughters, and the sympathy for her was overwhelming. Congressman Michael Fayen of Ohio publicly demanded that Burton's visa be revoked, calling the affair a public outrage and Burton's presence in America detrimental to the morals of the youth of the nation. Congressmen were making speeches about a movie star's love life on the floor of the House of Representatives. Then the Vatican newspaper stepped in. In April of 1962, L'Osservatore Romano, the official newspaper of the Holy See, published an open letter that raked Elizabeth Taylor across the coals. It did not name her directly, but everyone understood who it was about. It called her behavior an insult to the nobility of the hearth. It suggested her 4 children should be taken away from her, and it used the phrase that has followed her for the rest of her life. It called what she was doing erotic vagrancy. Elizabeth Taylor, decades later, in the interviews that formed the basis of the HBO documentary The Lost Tapes, said that reading that attack from the Vatican made her physically vomit. She was 30 years old, being told by the Pope's newspaper that she was too despicable to be a mother. The scandal did not slow the affair. If anything, it intensified it. Burton, dazed by the sheer scale of what was happening, made the remark that has been quoted ever since. He turned to his publicist and said, in effect, he had had affairs before. How was he supposed to know this woman was so famous she was knocking Khrushchev off the front page? That was the mid-Cold War, the height of superpower confrontation, and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were pushing nuclear brinkmanship off the front page of American newspapers. Cleopatra itself was, meanwhile, becoming a catastrophe. The production had already been in disarray before Elizabeth and Richard began their affair, cycling through directors, running massively over budget, shooting for years, nearly bankrupting 20th Century Fox. The affair added a level of drama that overwhelmed the film. When Cleopatra finally premiered in 1963, it was the most expensive movie ever made, at a cost that would translate to roughly $400 million today. And though it was actually the highest-grossing film of 1963, its budget was so enormous it took years to break even. The film that had brought Elizabeth and Richard together had, in becoming the vehicle for their affair, also nearly destroyed the studio that made it. They both divorced their spouses. Eddie Fisher was cast off cleanly, taken care of legally, and moved out of the picture. Sybil Burton, dignified to the end, moved to New York with her daughters. She never spoke publicly against Richard or against Elizabeth. She rebuilt her own life. She was the great injured party of the whole scandal, and she carried it with a quiet grace that only made the public sympathy for her deeper. On March 15, 1964, 9 days after Elizabeth's divorce from Eddie Fisher was finalized, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were married at the Ritz-Carlton in Montreal by a Unitarian minister. She was 32. He was 38. It was her fifth marriage and his second. They had waited 2 years and torn 2 other marriages apart to get to this wedding day. And now, the 2 of them were going to be married. And the world was about to see what happened when the 2 most magnetic people in Hollywood tried to build a life together, financed by an unlimited flow of money, poured into unlimited amounts of alcohol, played out on a stage the entire planet was watching. The great love affair was about to become a great marriage. Whether it could survive being one was another question entirely. For the first several years, the marriage worked. And the way it worked tells you a lot about what they had. They made films together, constantly. 11 of them, between 1963 and 1972. The VIPs, The Sandpiper, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, The Taming of the Shrew, The Comedians, Boom, Dr. Faustus, Under Milk Wood, Hammersmith is Out. There has never been another movie couple in the history of Hollywood who made anything close to 11 films together. And the reason they did was practical as much as artistic. When they worked together, they got to be together. When they worked apart, they were miserable. So they arranged their careers to stay in the same room, and the studios, understanding that Taylor and Burton on a poster was a guaranteed audience, financed almost anything they wanted to do. The pay was staggering. Elizabeth had been the first actress in history to earn $1 million for a single film. On Cleopatra, Burton, riding the wave of Taylor mania, was soon earning the same. Between them, they were, for a stretch of the mid-1960s, the highest-paid working couple in the entire industry. And Burton, who had grown up in a Welsh mining valley in genuine poverty, spent the money like a man who had never quite believed it was real. The jewelry became legendary. Burton's approach to Elizabeth's frequent fits of rage was to fight her, and then, when it was over, to reconcile by buying her something extraordinary. In 1968, he bought her the Krupp diamond, a 33-carat stone he presented to her on their yacht, the Charisma, moored on the River Thames. She wore it as a ring for the rest of her life and called it her favorite piece. A year later, in 1969, he outbid the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis at auction for a 69-carat pear-shaped diamond, paying over $1 million for it, simply because, as he later wrote, it belonged on the loveliest woman in the world. That stone became known as the Taylor-Burton diamond. He bought her a private jet on a whim. He bought her paintings and Van Goghs and Rolls-Royces. They lived on the yacht, they lived on Long Island, they lived in Switzerland, they lived in London. They travelled with an entourage of assistants, security, hairdressers and dogs, and every hotel they entered redecorated its suites in advance because Elizabeth insisted on it. They were, for the entire second half of the 1960s, the most watched couple on the planet, and everyone who came into contact with them noticed the same 2 things. The love was real, and the drinking was constant. Burton had drunk his entire adult life. He came from a Welsh drinking tradition, the drinking of poets and stage actors, and he was proud of it in the way people who cannot stop are often proud of it. He could drink enormous amounts and still, most of the time, perform. Elizabeth, who had been a lifelong social drinker in the manner of Hollywood royalty, learned to keep up with him. And when the 2 of them drank together, which was most nights, the drinking fueled a way of fighting that people who witnessed it never quite forgot. Their fights were legendary. Hotels asked them to leave. Bottles and glasses were thrown. Screaming matches spilled out of restaurants. Both of them were quick-tongued, verbal, cruel when they wanted to be, and years of intimacy had taught each of them exactly where the other one's wounds were. Burton would attack her looks. Elizabeth would attack his talent. They would leave each other in tears, and then, hours later, they would be back in bed together, and the next morning, Burton would go and buy her a diamond. There is a description that Kate Burton, Richard's daughter with Sybil, gave decades later that captures the paradox of it. She said her father was an alcoholic, but that in her entire 26 years of life with him, she saw him drunk perhaps 5 times. He carried it. Elizabeth carried it. The world saw the diamonds and the yachts and the 11 films, and did not see, most of the time, the slow, steady damage that was accumulating underneath, because that is the thing that made the marriage, that made them mythic, also the thing that ruined them both. It was not just the drinking. It was that they could not moderate anything, either of them. They loved at full volume. They fought at full volume. They spent money at full volume. They drank at full volume. There was no room in the marriage for a quiet Tuesday night at home, for a small, calm, ordinary hour. Everything was Cleopatra, all the time. And in 1966, they took that entire volatile chemistry into a soundstage to make a film about a marriage that was drinking itself to death. The name of that film was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and it would win Elizabeth her second Oscar, and it would come as close as any film ever has to being, on screen, the exact thing the actors making it were becoming off-screen. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was Edward Albee's play about a middle-aged American college professor and his wife who spend a long alcoholic night eviscerating each other in front of a younger couple they have invited over. It is one of the most brutal portraits of a marriage ever written for the American stage. When the film adaptation was announced in 1965, the casting of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton in the 2 leads was, on the face of it, absurd. Elizabeth was 33, one of the most glamorous women in the world. The character she was being asked to play, Martha, was supposed to be a bitter, blowsy, middle-aged academic wife in her 50s, drunk and disappointed and cruel. Elizabeth threw herself into the transformation. She gained weight for the role, deliberately let herself go, wore ugly clothes, roughened her voice. The critics who saw the film could not believe what she had done. She was extraordinary in it, disappearing entirely into a woman she should not have been able to play. Burton was equally extraordinary as George, Martha's husband, the failed academic, verbal, cutting, quietly ruined. The film was directed by Mike Nichols in his directorial debut, and it was the first film in Hollywood history to use language previously forbidden by the production code. The dialogue was brutal, obscene, adult in a way American cinema had not been before. When it was released in 1966, it was a sensation. Elizabeth Taylor won her second Academy Award for it, for Best Actress. Burton was nominated for Best Actor and lost. It was one of the greatest performances of his career, and it would not, in fact, ever be Academy Award-winning work. He would be nominated 7 times over his career and never win, ever. That fact would become one of the private wounds of his life. But the film's real significance to their marriage is what it revealed to them both. Because when the shoot ended and the makeup came off, Elizabeth and Richard looked at each other and understood, in a way they had been able to avoid understanding before, that the George and Martha they had just spent months playing were not so different from the Elizabeth and Richard they were becoming at home. They had played, brilliantly, a marriage that was drinking itself to death, and they had played it drawing on things that were increasingly true of their own lives. The verbal cruelty, the alcohol, the way 2 intelligent people who loved each other could still tear each other apart with the same relentless precision every night. It was too accurate to be entirely comfortable. The film was a triumph, and it was a private diagnosis. For a few more years, they held it together. Through 1967, 1968, 1969, they kept working, kept traveling, kept buying diamonds, kept fighting. The Krupp diamond came, the Taylor-Burton diamond came. Elizabeth's 40th birthday in 1972 was celebrated with a massive party in Budapest, guests including Princess Grace of Monaco and Raquel Welch, staged so Elizabeth could wear the enormous 17th-century diamond pendant Burton had bought her for the occasion. The excess kept escalating because both of them had learned that only extravagance could still generate the intensity that ordinary life could not. But something was going wrong underneath. Burton's drinking, which had always been heavy, was getting worse. Elizabeth's own health, never robust, was deteriorating. She had a series of surgeries through the late 60s and early 70s, including a hysterectomy, and each surgery brought with it prescription painkillers, and the painkillers began to combine with the drinking in ways that neither of them controlled well. Both of them were, quietly, developing addictions that would eventually own them. The 11 films they made together did not maintain their quality. After Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and The Taming of the Shrew, the projects became weaker. Some of them were commercial flops. Some, like Boom, were critical disasters. The couple who had been the biggest thing in the world stopped being able to guarantee a hit simply by appearing together. Their prices remained enormous, but their bankability was beginning to slip, and both of them knew it. By the early 1970s, the strain was showing. The magic that had made them work at the start was still there, but it was buried now under years of alcohol, exhaustion, professional pressure, and the sheer wear of being the most watched couple in the world for a decade straight. They fought harder, they drank harder, they spent more time apart, working on separate projects, and each separation was longer and more damaging than the last. Elizabeth loved him, Richard loved her. That had not changed, and would never change. But loving each other, they were discovering, was not the same as being able to live with each other, and the marriage that had begun as the greatest love affair of the 20th century was starting to buckle under the weight of what the two of them had built and consumed. In June of 1974, they finally admitted it. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were getting divorced. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Elizabeth spoke to the press about the divorce with a line that captured the whole marriage in 12 words. She said she loved Richard with every fibre of her soul, but they could not be together. The press called them the battling Burtons, two larger-than-life stars whose passion had simply burned too bright. The framing was accurate as far as it went, but it missed what was actually happening, which was that both of them were addicts, and the marriage had become a machine for feeding the addiction, and the only way either of them could think of to slow the damage was to get away from each other. Neither of them handled the separation well. For 16 months, from June of 1974 to October of 1975, they lived apart, saw other people, tried to rebuild themselves as individuals, and failed. Burton drank harder without Elizabeth than he had drunk with her. He had a relationship with a Belgian princess named Elizabeth of Yugoslavia, and it did not fill the space. He worked, he travelled, he brooded. Elizabeth, meanwhile, tried and failed to move on. She was seen with other men. She continued to work. And she and Richard continued, incessantly, to talk to each other on the phone, to send messages, to circle around what they had thrown away. They could not stay together. They could not stay apart. In the autumn of 1975, they arranged a reconciliation trip to Africa. What was supposed to be a trip became, within days, something else. On October 10, 1975, 16 months after their divorce had been finalized, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton married each other for the second time, in a 20-minute ceremony on the banks of the Chobe River in Kasane, Botswana. Elizabeth wore a flowing green kaftan. There were almost no witnesses. It was a fever dream wedding in the middle of an African national park, arranged in a matter of days, both of them convinced that they had been idiots the first time and were going to do it right this time. They were not going to do it right this time. They were going to fail faster this time than they had the first time, because nothing had actually changed. The drinking had gotten worse in the year apart, not better. Neither of them had done the work of dealing with the addiction that had wrecked the first marriage. They had reunited on the strength of feeling alone, and feeling alone was not going to be enough to overcome what alcohol was doing to both of them. They came back from Botswana into their old life, with their old habits, and within weeks the same fights were happening, worse now, because they had thrown away their own divorce to be here. The second marriage lasted 9 months. By the summer of 1976, they had separated again. The divorce was final by August. Both of them, that same year, married other people, moving with the speed of two people trying to prove to themselves that they could actually be apart. Elizabeth married John Warner, a Republican politician from Virginia who would soon be a United States Senator. Richard married a British model named Susan Hunt. The world watched, bewildered, as the couple who had just remarried and re-divorced within 9 months tried to construct alternative lives in the space of a summer. Both of the new marriages were, in a way, admissions of defeat. Neither of them had married for the same reasons they had once loved each other. Elizabeth married a stable, sober, respectable American politician because she needed stability and sobriety and respectability, and Richard married a young, calm English model because he needed someone who was not Elizabeth. They were choosing the opposites of what they had been to each other, hoping the opposites would save them. Neither marriage lasted because they were built on running away from something rather than moving toward something. Elizabeth's marriage to John Warner took her to Washington, D.C., where she found herself the wife of a senator, playing the role of political spouse, and where she also, more dangerously, discovered how alone she was inside a life that had become quiet in exactly the wrong ways. She had grown up on soundstages, in noise and drama, and marriage to a senator meant long stretches of solitude that a woman with her addictions could not safely tolerate. She began to drink harder in Washington than she ever had in Rome. Burton, in London, was doing the same. Both of them, in the late 1970s, were sliding into serious physical crisis, and both marriages were, quietly, ending, and both of them knew where the other one was, at all times. Elizabeth and Richard divorced their new spouses in 1982. In the same year, an accidental coordination that told you everything about how connected their lives had remained, even when they were supposedly apart. Both of them were single again. Both of them were falling apart. And in 1983, they agreed to do one more thing together, a Broadway production of Noel Coward's Private Lives, a play, fittingly, about two divorced people who cannot stop being drawn back to each other. It would be the last time Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton ever worked together. Private Lives was the perfect play for them, which was also the terrible reason for doing it. Noel Coward's 1930 comedy is about a divorced couple who meet again on their honeymoons with new spouses and cannot resist each other. Casting Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, twice divorced from each other and both freshly single from other marriages, was so on the nose that it stopped being clever and became slightly desperate. Elizabeth would later admit she had taken the play mainly to be with Richard again, to spend 7 months touring alongside him, playing versions of themselves. The audiences came for the same reason. They came to see Liz and Dick. What they got was a struggle. The production toured through 1983, and it was not, by any critical measure, a triumph. Elizabeth was 51, Richard 57, and both of them were physically and vocally in worse shape than they had been the last time they had shared a stage. Elizabeth had been in and out of the Betty Ford Center for her addictions to painkillers and alcohol, one of the first major celebrities to publicly acknowledge going to rehab, and she was fighting to stay sober. Richard was still drinking, quietly but consistently, and his health was visibly failing. His performances were uneven. There were nights when it worked, when the old chemistry between them flickered into something the audience could feel. There were nights when it did not, and Elizabeth was noticeably struggling on stage. The tour was, in retrospect, a farewell they did not know they were staging. They were saying goodbye to each other without either of them being able to say it out loud, doing it on a stage every night by playing two people saying goodbye and coming back together forever. When the run ended, they went their separate ways again. Richard, that same year, married for the 5th and final time to a production assistant named Sally Hay, a woman who provided the calm domestic stability he had been looking for and never found with Elizabeth. Elizabeth herself remained single and returned to Los Angeles. They spoke often, all through the following year. Long phone calls, letters. Whatever had been between them since 1961 had never actually stopped. Elizabeth was working her way through sobriety. Richard was managing his own addictions less successfully. The plans they made were the small plans of two people who had grown into a friendship they could not have had while they were married. They talked about maybe working together again someday. They talked about what they had done to each other. Elizabeth kept the letters he wrote her. The last of them arrived in the summer of 1984. Richard had been living in Séligny, Switzerland, in a house he had owned for years. On Saturday, August 4th, 1984, he had complained during the day of a headache. He went to bed early. During the night, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage in his sleep. His wife Sally found him unconscious the next morning. He was rushed to a hospital in Geneva, where surgeons operated for hours, but the bleeding into his brain was too extensive. Richard Burton died on August 5th, 1984, without regaining consciousness. He was 58 years old. The cause was recorded as a cerebral hemorrhage. What the medical record did not say, but everyone who knew him knew, was that decades of hard drinking had prepared his body for exactly this kind of ending. His health had been visibly failing for years. He had, in the plainest sense, drunk himself to a stroke at 58, and it was not really unexpected to the people who loved him. It was simply too soon. Elizabeth received the news in California and collapsed. The love of her life was dead. He had been dead of an alcohol-driven brain hemorrhage at 58, and she had been in another marriage when it happened, and there was nothing to do about any of it now. She wanted, immediately, to go to the funeral in Wales, to say goodbye, to be there. Sally Burton, Richard's widow, refused to let her attend. The reasoning was not petty. Sally understood that the funeral of Richard Burton would be a media catastrophe if Elizabeth Taylor were there. Every camera in the world would be on Elizabeth, not on the coffin. The Welsh village where Richard was to be buried would be overrun. Sally wanted her husband to be mourned as Richard Jenkins, the coal miner's son from Pontrhydyfen, and not as Elizabeth Taylor's ex-husband. She asked Elizabeth not to come. Elizabeth respected the request. She waited. Eventually, after the funeral was over, she flew to Wales alone. She visited his grave privately, when the cameras were gone, and she stood there for a long time. She did not tell the press she had done it. It only came out later. She was 52 years old. She had another 27 years to live. She would never be married to Richard Burton again, and Richard Burton would never be alive again. But somewhere in her house in Bel Air, she had a letter he had written her only days before he died, and she was going to keep it in the drawer of her bedside table for the rest of her life. The letter said he wanted to come home. That was the essence of it. Elizabeth kept the specifics private for the rest of her life, but she confirmed, in the interviews she gave in her later years, that Richard had written to her in the last days before his death, and that in that letter he had told her that he wanted to come home, and that home meant her. He had been married to Sally. He had been sober adjacent, calmer, more settled than he had been in decades. And still, days before he died, he had put on paper the thing that had been true since Rome in 1961, which was that whatever peace he had built anywhere else had not replaced her. She kept that letter in the drawer of her bedside table for the next 27 years. It was there when she went to sleep every night. It was there when she died. The rest of her life without him was long and remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with Richard Burton and everything to do with the person she had become by loving him and losing him. She kept drinking, on and off, through the late 1980s, and she went back to the Betty Ford Center a second time in 1988. This time it took. She got sober and mostly stayed sober for the rest of her life, though her body was already carrying the damage of decades of alcohol and painkillers and dozens of surgeries. She had, over the course of her life, undergone something like 100 separate operations on her hips, her back, her heart, her spine. The scars of her physical body were the accumulation of the same excess that had killed Richard, just applied in slower motion to a stronger constitution. And then, in the mid-1980s, the AIDS epidemic began, and Elizabeth Taylor found the purpose that would define the last 25 years of her life. Her close friend Rock Hudson had been diagnosed with AIDS in 1984 and died in 1985, the same year Richard died. The disease was, at that point, a shame-covered death sentence. Presidents refused to say the word. Studios refused to acknowledge which of their stars were dying. Elizabeth Taylor did what almost no other major celebrity in Hollywood would do, which was to become a public face and a public fundraiser for AIDS research. She co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research. She testified before Congress. She raised, over the following decades, hundreds of millions of dollars. She was one of the first genuinely famous people in the world to hug an AIDS patient in public, at a time when the public was terrified of contact. And she used the enormous, complicated, scandal-battered fame she had built with Richard Burton, and the fame she had inherited from being famous her entire life, to force a country to look at a disease it wanted to ignore. She said, later, that this work gave her the purpose of her life. It also, in the strange way things sometimes work out, gave meaning to all the years of tabloid excess. She had been the most watched woman in the world for a reason. Now she was using that attention for something that mattered. She kept marrying, briefly. Her seventh husband was a construction worker named Larry Fortensky, whom she met at the Betty Ford Center, and that marriage lasted 5 years. She kept working, occasionally, in television and film. She kept, through all of it, the letter in the drawer. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, of congestive heart failure. She was 79 years old. Her heart had been failing for years, worn out by everything the woman had put it through. She had outlived Richard by 27 years, Rock Hudson by 26, most of her Hollywood generation. Nancy Sinatra, of a slightly earlier generation, would outlive her, but by 2011 Elizabeth was one of the last of the great classical Hollywood stars. She had been famous, in the specific way that only she was famous, for almost 70 consecutive years, from National Velvet at 12 to the day she died at 79. Look at the whole shape of it. 2 of the most talented actors of the 20th century, one of them the greatest classical stage actor of his generation, the other one of the most photographed women in the history of the world. They met on a soundstage in Rome and could not stop. They tore apart 2 marriages, defied a US congressman, were denounced by the Vatican for erotic vagrancy, married each other in Montreal, made 11 films together, spent millions of dollars on diamonds and yachts, drank themselves toward parallel destructions, divorced each other in 1974, remarried each other in Botswana in 1975, divorced again in 1976, married other people, drank harder apart than they had together, and could not, in 23 years, stop finding their way back to each other. Richard drank himself to a stroke at 58. Elizabeth spent decades absorbing the damage of the same excess, her body giving way piece by piece, until her heart finally stopped at 79. The title says the marriage ruined them both, and it did. The alcohol, the excess, the sheer volume at which they lived, wore both of their bodies out ahead of schedule and made ordinary lives impossible for either of them ever again. Richard never won an Academy Award he deserved because his private life had become the story of him. Elizabeth's serious work was for years overwhelmed by the tabloid circus of being Mrs. Richard Burton. They took the 2 biggest talents in the room and used them to fuel something that consumed both of them. And still, at the end, in a drawer beside her bed, Elizabeth Taylor kept a letter in which the man she had loved since she was 30 told her, days before he died, that he wanted to come home. Home meant her. He never made it home, but she kept the letter, and she carried what it said for the last 27 years of her life. And when she died in 2011 at 79, in some sense that even the tabloids never quite captured, she was still married to Richard Burton. She always had been. Nothing else, however scandalous, however excessive, however ruinous, had ever come close. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.